Somebody has a cute little squeak. There we go. All right. So last chapter, and anything left from last time that we wanted to address? Jesus is sort of the embodiment of the wisdom of God. Anything left from that?
Wasn't here, so I, like everything else, I've loved the chapter, and I loved learning for the first time in my life about Sophia. I remember the first time I heard Bishop Winterard refer to the Holy Spirit as she. And I thought, that's wonderful. Oh, I'm so glad that there's a relationship with women. And this opened my eyes to something that my Jewish friends have not told me about the wisdom of God and the female part of it. The footnotes are underlined in my book. I mean, I just love it to death. And so that was a wonderful learning experience for me.
Great. So in this last chapter, he sort of reprises the book in general, and in his definition of Jesus as a spirit person, a subversive sage, social prophet, movement founder who invited his followers and hearers into a transformative relationship with the same spirit that he himself knew, and into a community whose social vision was shaped by the core value of compassion. You know, it's always nice when there's a book study to do that you can weave it into your sermon. It just makes it a little bit more.
Yeah.
sort of helps with double duty. So that was great. But then he asked the question, and this was one that was sort of at the root when I suggested, or when I decided that we would do this book study, is, if that's your vision of Jesus, what does that mean about how you live your Christian life? How do you put that belief, pardon that use of that word, that trust, that giving of your heart, how do you translate that into how you live your day-to-day life? And so to get into that, he wanted to sort of broaden the perspective, to get away from just looking at the New Testament, but to situate Jesus, but also our own thinking in the broader stories of the entire Bible. And he brings up this category of what he calls story theology, and I understand why he calls it that. When I was in seminary, this was a new thing. I was in seminary in the late 70s, early 80s, and so this was very, very new, and it wasn't called story theology, it was called narrative theology, I think because that sounded more scholarly than story theology, which made it sound like bedtime. So he talks about how this discusses the narrative character of the Bible, or the centrality of story. And he distinguishes it from, the historical looking at it, or the teasing out of all of the theological bits and pieces, but to see, the story, that these were stories. And he pushes home the idea that, until Gutenberg, nobody was reading this stuff except maybe some monks, but that people were hearing the stories being told. If you can imagine, I can't, but if you can imagine somebody standing up front and reading the book of Proverbs, nobody's going to remember much. But if you read the David story, people are going to remember it because it's a narrative. And so, and Borg points out that the other ways that sort of pre-Gutenberg folks learned was through stained glass. We still tell stories through stained glass, through rituals, and he points out Passover ritual. But we have them ourselves. We have rituals in what we do as Anglicans. And then hymns, because you can remember hymns. You'll go away humming "Where Across the Crowded Ways of Life," or, "I Will Love the Lord," or all of those kinds of things. You will not go away remembering much of what I said in the sermon. So that's just the nature of those things. And so he really, really pushes those kinds of things home. And he says that, yes, there's this grand sweep of story in Scripture, from paradise to paradise lost, ending with paradise regained, at least in the Christian Bible. I'm not sure it works quite the same in the Hebrew Scriptures, but in the Christian Bible, you've got that arc. And then all the little stories that we see. But then he points out that there are a few what he calls macro stories. And so what he spends really the rest of the chapter doing is talking about these macro stories. But he does it in the context of an assertion, I guess, or a realization by the great religion scholar William James in his landmark book of a century or more ago, called The Varieties of Religious Experience. Very, very famous long book. And in which, in his conclusion, he says that all religions really at root try and do two things. They try and define what the central problem is that humans face, and then what is the solution to that problem. And so Borg picks those questions up and runs with them through the rest of this chapter. So before we get into some of those macro stories, does that idea make sense? Does this idea of story theology, does the idea of what religions do, does that make sense to you? Are there questions?
I knew a lot of those stories from preschool at Sunday school.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew those stories.
Deb, what were you going to say?
The same thing. How many of us do not remember certain stories from Sunday school? Daniel in the lion's den, for example. I mean, these things are just really are vivid stories that stick with you.
Yeah. The other thing about stories too is that hopefully as we mature, our understanding of them will mature too. I remember a 3-year-old Crystal, time for bed, and I went through the usual ritual, tomorrow's preschool, take your clothes off, put in the hamper, put your shoes in the closet, here's your clothes for tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. And she stood there and looked me straight in the eye and said, "I am not taking my shoes off." And I went, "Oh, yes, you are, young lady." And guess what? She went to bed with her shoes on. And why did she not want to take her shoes off? Because she did the burning bush that day. And if she took her shoes off, the house would catch on fire. You cannot argue theology with a 3-year-old at bedtime.
Want another anecdote?
But
I had a parent tell me that her son there was a beautiful rose bush that bloomed all over the place on St. Anne's campus, and they were admiring it. And then the little boy said to her, "Don't tell Pastor Mary about that bush." And she said, "Well, why ever not?" He said, "Because she and her God like to burn bushes."
So there is a dilemma about story theology that hopefully, we address as people grow up. But it's interesting because I wonder how much of the different directions that Christianity has taken, comes directly from the fact that people have interpreted those story theology differently.
Or literally.
Yeah, or literally, yeah. Right. But differently,
Rachel Held Evans' last book was Inspired, was the name of the book, and it is a little bit even more modern than Borg's take on story theology. It was really, I commend it to you if you haven't read it.
Cool. Yeah. And of course, one of the things that stories do, and I can't remember if Borg said this or if I read it someplace else within last week, but one thing that stories do is that they tell the truth, which is different than some sort of proclaiming some objective truth, that the truth that stories tell, get at you in a different way than a textbook. And so, what's the story of the lion, Daniel in the lion's den? What's the story of, burning bush? They tell truth that's different than whether or not a bush actually burns.
Yeah,
And
truth is
focusing
different
on
than
that
fact.
is just a very, very different kettle of fish. So,
and it happens in a non-threatening way. So it's not as if someone's lecturing you. Sort of Joe Biden's Mr. Rogers approach that is supposed to be told, but it's more palatable.
Yeah, the invitation into that. Yeah.
But in one of his books, Borg talks about how Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon, and he watched or listened to Lake Wobegon stories. Those are fictional, but they tell truths about life, and so that's the other piece of stories, is that they may be fictional, but they tell truths about life.
This
Right,
is a
right.
lesson.
So
Just to
moving
put on
along
a
here.
different spin, the
Closer.
stories can also be told, and people walk away at 12 thinking they know the stories, and the interpretations that may have been given by their Sunday school teacher or whatever are not the whole as they could be. And I think
I don't know why we have a double.
I've met an awful lot of adults who sort of stopped religion at 12 and don't have an adult form that can help them through the issues that they're dealing with. So they are great, but they need to be revisited and reinterpreted as time goes on.
Yeah.
And that's one of the great things of remaining involved with Sunday school as the brain matures and as there's more ideas coming in, and being able to ask those questions, not having them shut down. And that's typical for the teenage brain to question many things and to start to see that and to think. And I think Borg's description, which was earlier in maybe chapter 1 or 2, about his own thinking through things and coming to realization about them, is what's so crucial about us continuing this learning. It's crucial to us in our own spiritual journey to continue to rethink and to redo.
And we have, I think giving permission for that is from the side of the adults is absolutely critical. So moving into these stories, he identifies 3. He says 2 of them are really stories as you would think of a story, and the other one was less of a story and more of an institution. We'll get to that in a second. But he starts with the story that he calls the Exodus story. Certainly one of these great narrative of the Hebrew Bible that you've got. It was primal, everything. This was how the ancient Israelites were founded. There's that early bit about Abraham and then ending up in Egypt, but rather that's sort of the pre-story. It's I read a lot of novels, or a lot of mystery novels, where the first chapter just tells you why the rest of the book is being written.
Yes,
and I kind of see a little bit about Abraham and all that stuff as sort of being why the rest of the book is written. So he talks about sort of the Exodus story, and it was to be told by parents to children. and it was to be remembered and celebrated. The Passover is a celebration of that story. It's a repetition of that story. And if you've ever been to a Passover Seder, there are a number of questions. And one of the questions that begins it is, why is this night different than any other night? And the answer is, it's because this is the night it's first person present. It's not, this is the night our ancestors this happened to our ancestors. This is the night this experience happened to us. And so this story is involving of the living, not just of the dead. And then he asserts, points out, that it's a story about bondage and liberation, and then a journey and a destination. The Israelites were in bondage. Moses led them out, that liberation. And then they had to journey that time in the wilderness until they made it to the promised land. And all of those pieces of the story are critical to understanding the story as a whole, or to internalizing the story as a whole. And so he goes back to William James's sort of schema, and he says, well, what's this saying? And he says that our problem is that we're in bondage, and that the solution is being led out. But how that story works is that not just, we're not in Egypt, literally, but the fact that it's a story allows us to try and discern or answer the question, to what are we in bondage? Socially, liturgically, personally, what are the things that bind us, that keep us from really experiencing something whole? I remember speaking about liturgically, many of you know that I was ordained in an African-American Episcopal church. Well, their freedom in worship is very different than the freedom that I see at St. John's Cathedral or even at Good Shepherd. And so what kind of bondage are we held into? And so what is going to lead us out? So Pharaoh comes and leads us out. But what is that wilderness through which we pass? A place of danger, but also of nourishment, Borg points out. And then we finally end up in the promised land. So that's this story, is the story of being in bondage through liberation, through journeying. And if you read the book, you'll see that word journey show up over and over and over again. That journeying to the promised land. Or as he says, the story of the image, or the story of the Exodus, images the religious life as a journey from the life of bondage to life in the presence of God. So that's that journey. He then says that the second great story, or the second great macro story of Scripture, is exile and return. And I use this one all the time, probably more than I used the Exodus story. I've used it a number of times as we've talked about COVID, that we are now exiled in COVID land. It's not bondage in quite the same way, although other people might argue that that we've been held in bondage by government. They're telling us we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't do this, and we're going to proclaim our freedom. So they're appealing to a different narrative than the narrative or the story of exile and return. So of course, this one was grounded in Israel's or Judah's historical experience. It's all about Babylon. And it really became so central through the post-exilic experience. All of the prophets, well, many of the prophets refer in one way or another to this period of exile. So he then says, of course, what's it like to be in exile? And he says, we're feeling alienated. We're feeling cut off from those things that gave us life and hope. We're lonely. We're sad. All of those kinds of things. And he gives us some really great examples. You think, by the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept. How can I sing the songs of the old place when I'm not there? Or he points out, O come, Emmanuel. you know, for us who mourn in lowly exile here, these great images, or more contemporaneously, he refers to the movie E.T. and E.T. who home, you know, wants to go home. A story of exile and return, and all of those things that we miss in our current situation that were ours and that we want to return to. And, you know, I really sort of think that this is so descriptive of where we are now. You know, COVID land, I really do think is a classic exile. If you think about the Jews who were exiled for 50 years, this is short, that feels like forever. You know, they would have been there for 2.5 generations. Very few people would have returned from Babylon to Judea. Very few, and even those that would have returned probably wouldn't have remembered much because they would have been children, you know, when they left. So, you know, this is a long time. So exile. The problem is that we're exiled, we're alienated, we're estranged, and the solution is return. And so this is a story of journeying or homecoming. Classic, big story in the Hebrew Bible. And then the last of the stories that he refers to, he says, isn't really a story, but is an institution. But it's a story we tell. And it's a story that we tell about our sin and our need for forgiveness. And so therefore it requires some sort of a institution of the temple, the priesthood, sacrifice, something to restore us to right relationship with God. As he says, it's a story of sin, guilt, sacrifice, and forgiveness. And central to it, no surprise, are notions of impurity, defilement, and uncleanness, or that primal sense of being stained. You know, so that was something clearly that Augustine picked up very clearly in the 5th century about original sin.
Yes.
That has really colored the West's understanding of theology ever since. But that one has become incredibly powerful. So in the story, we're sinners who've broken God's law, stand guilty before God, and therefore we require something to restore us to that right relationship, and that something is a sacrifice in Christian theology, the sacrifice on the cross. So those are those 3 stories. And so how do you see them playing out in your life or experience, or what questions, thoughts, anything about those 3 stories do you have?
The sentence in this chapter that really screamed COVID land to me was it was in the section, the middle of the 3 stories, the Exile and Return. It images the religious life as a journey to the place where God is present, which for me, this time in COVID land has been much more introspective rather than looking outward. It's looking inward to find the place where God is present within me.
He points out, you know, that the wilderness, you know, using the Exodus story, but the wilderness is a place of danger and nourishment. And clearly the Jews' experience in Babylon was one of estrangement, but also one of great flourishing. When they returned to Judea or Judah, they had a whole lot of stuff that they didn't have before that really enriched the expression of their own expression of their religious faith. So, you know, I can see what you're saying, Deb. I think it fits both of those stories in some respects.
There was another line that was in the book that resonated with me. That was that the liberation is only the beginning.
Other thoughts, questions?
Father, it's interesting. We are a country of the Exodus. None of us have been here for centuries and centuries and centuries. We've all come from different parts of the world. The African Americans, it was over 400 years ago, not by choice. So we're a country that are here in that Exodus experience can be from economics. My grandfather left Sicily because of the Depression. Not the 30s Depression, the 1890s Depression.
Depression.
Had no living and couldn't make it, so he came here. My grandmother, my Polish grandmother, came here in the pre-World War I because her brothers were kidnapped by the Germans in the World War I, and she never saw them again. So she said, this is not a good political place to live. So I am politically and economically from an exodus of two different countries. And you can tell those stories in just about every one of us. Somebody came from somewhere, which is what this country is about. We're very unique in that perspective of maybe 100 years ago or less, something happened to us that is why we are here.
To just spin that a bit, you could argue on the other hand that, the Native Americans have been put into bondage by us who were liberated, who came here from something else, and are seeking a full freedom. So it's a powerful story. It is clearly a powerful story.
As it's used in African American theology, America is Egypt. For white people, it has been the promised land. So another way to use the same story based on your experience.
The story that meant the most to me is they're all important, but the priestly story. And a lot of that has to do with my struggle with my daughter's alcoholism. I'm in a support group, and we meet every Wednesday evening, which is why I haven't been doing the church gathering. But this past Wednesday, I shared the fact that I didn't know what alcoholism was. My parents, we had no alcohol in our house. And so there wasn't drinking. There wasn't drinking at holidays. And we had iced tea and we had other things, but we certainly didn't have alcohol. And that purity is something I grew up with. That this is what you do to be a righteous person and to not cross that line. And so accepting that Mary's alcohol is what is sin. And in my deliberations over this, I went to a quest, and the minister who basically leads the programs for Quest is a former Presbyterian minister. And the thing that I remember the most is he brought up the definition of sin. And I think in the Indo-European or whatever, it means missing the mark. And that has meant a lot to me when I think about the purity and what sin is, missing the mark. But it doesn't mean that there cannot be another chance to make the mark. So that section is important to me.
Anyone else?
I had some thoughts about this whole idea that you just talked about, Gary, of original sin. And I have always, not always, but in my fully adult world, I have been grateful for the notion of human frailty, because among other things, that lets us inquire about all things, including the nature of God and spirituality, but know that we will never fully understand God And that's right. That's to be expected because we are fallible. But the thought that just came to me is this problem of evil as what I would think of as and is evil a frailty, or does it exist as a separate thing altogether?
Good question. You know, you could argue that evil is the oppressor. Evil is that takes you into that exiles you or keeps you there. Or, I mean, thinking of it in terms of sort of broader story categories, or that evil is a power out there to which some people pledge allegiance. So I think it's all of those things, possibly depending on how you approach it. Irma noted, that the priestly story makes a whole lot of sense to her. There are others who might say, well, I don't see my issue as sin, but I'm certainly in bondage to something, which is different, which can be conceived of different and then dealt with differently. So I think that's why all three of these stories are pretty powerful. He goes on then to say, how does Jesus relate to all of these? And he refers to this great book by Swedish theologian Gustav Aulén called Christos Victor, where he relates these sort of three pictures of Jesus, or the way that we've conceived of Jesus in terms of these great stories. And the first one being Christos Victor, sort of the title of the book, is that the central work of Christ is to triumph over the powers that hold humans in bondage. So there's this triumphing thing here, like the Exodus story. Or he refers to the substitutionary. This is probably the way that many Westerners think about what Jesus did on the cross, as this sort of substitution for us, our death and all that kind of stuff. That's the priestly answer being borne out in Christian theology. And then he talks, this one's not quite as apparent, and he even admits it, is that Jesus also reveals something that is true. And so that's that revelatory or disclosure, and he sees that as leading one out of exile, returning. Now we've been sojourning in falsehood, and now we're being led out into something else. That those are those three things. But he stresses, and I think that this is very true, that the priestly story is the one that's dominated the popular image of Jesus, especially in the West. The dying Savior whose death is a sacrifice for our sins. I think that that's the one we hear of. If you were to talk to folks who weren't Christian, and you just said, what's the Christian story about who Jesus was and what he did? I think that's the answer that they would give. Is that, well, I think you all believe that he died for your sins. And so he sees that is kind of a problem. And he goes through, I don't want to go through all of them because we're kind of running out of time, but he goes through 6 reasons why that priestly version is sort of limiting. But he then says that there are 4 things that these macro stories all share. They're all stories of suffering and being at an experiential distance from God, whether it's you're exiled, you're at Exodus, or you're a sinner. He says they all make powerful affirmations about the human condition, but also about God, and that God is ultimately involved in our lives. God is not out there, but God is here. They're all stories of hope. God doesn't want our present condition of exile or bondage to be the end of the story. God wants something more than that. And they're all stories of a journey. And this is where he really sort of puts all of this thing together. And so he encourages us to see Jesus and the Christian life in light of all of those stories. And I think they're true for all of us in separate points, but why are we just so quick to default to I'm a sinner, rather than to default to I'm in bondage, or to default to I'm in exile? Why is that sin priestly one, the one that we so quickly jump to? But he encourages us to see, again, Jesus and the Christian life in light of all of them, that Jesus subverted that conventional wisdom, like being under bondage or exile. We're in that relationship to conventional wisdom, and he came to set captives free. A little bit of, the point of my sermon is that we can be so in bondage to the purity thing that we can't even take care of other people because we're afraid of what it will do to us. That's so hard. He then points out that Jesus teaches a why, which he sees as a journey. And then he subverts the priestly story to keep this going as something that's going on and on and on. It's not just a once and for all. I'm saved. I don't need to worry about it. That our life is always going forward. Something more is happening. And then he closes by saying that the New Testament has a macro story of itself, and that's called discipleship. That we are journeying with Jesus. We are following Jesus. We are eating with Jesus. We are denying Jesus. We are questioning Jesus. All of these things are part of that ongoing journey, because you heard the disciples doing that. You saw their betrayal, you heard their denial, you heard their questioning. That journeying with Jesus is not being a faithful dog on a leash. There's something else going on here that implies a significant relationship. And so he says that this is a journey, a journey of transformation. It's not a life of believing or obeying, but being in relationship. And I think those of us who are parents, but all of a sudden also all of us who have been children, because that's all of us, know that we are in relationship with our parents, even though we may not have always obeyed, we may not always have believed, we doubted, we argued with, but we are also always in a relationship with them, which has made us who we are, for better or for worse, or all of those shades in between. And then he sort of ends with this statement, and then we'll just open it up for questions here. Believing in Jesus does not mean believing doctrines about him. Rather, it means to give one's heart, oneself at its deepest level, to the post-Easter Jesus who is the living Lord, the side of God turned toward us, the face of God, the Lord who is also the Spirit. Jesus is not simply a figure of the past, but a figure of the present. And I think that, that's what he would say, is to meet Jesus again for the first time, is to enter into that ongoing relationship with him, not to read the Gospels and put them on the shelf and say it's sort of once and for all delivered, and now we know what to do. So with that, what kinds of overall questions, learnings, ideas, what kind of impact might that have? Where do you go from here? How do we want to conclude these weeks together?
I'm sorry it's coming to an end.
Yeah.
It's a lot there.
Really good. This was a really good seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.
For me, Father, was when the Bishop Kim was installed, there was a sermon given by another bishop, African-American woman. She talked about getting on the Jesus train.
Ah, that's right.
And what she was saying was what Borg says: your time with Jesus and God is a journey. And are they with you? Do they walk with you as you live day by day? Or do you put them aside and ignore them? And she just gave wonderful examples of what that entailed in love and in forgiveness. And I think that's the thing that I've learned in my years, is that when I walk through my day, if I do something or I say something, I kind of sense that Jesus is standing next to me, not saying, just saying, well, what did you think about that? Did you do that right? Why did you do that? How do you perceive that? When you see an injustice, what comes to your mind? And that's the journey of being a Christian.
Thank you, Mike. That's really profound. Thank you.
So is that an answer, Mike, to how do we have a relationship? How do we get in step with transformation?
I forgot the bishop's name, and I just know him very well. He wrote a wonderful book on how we live our lives daily and how are we saved. And his main thesis was that heaven is today. It's not when you die. And heaven is your life. And you include Christian principles in it to make your life special every day. And that theme carries again partially with Borg. Although he disagreed with Borg on many things, he did understand what Borg was talking about. And so it's that ability to carry that with you, so that when you're in situations of financial decisions or family decisions, can you make those and still keep your faith current? We tend to use our faith when we need it and not with us all the time.
Uh-huh. Is it like, so where do we go from here? Is that like some will choose contemplation, like Teresa of Avila, and in the contemplation, then they move to service, thinking about the hows and the whats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Everyone's going to take it a little differently. Again, as I said early on, and Borg, points out, is that Jesus was a combination of all of these things: this spirit, this teacher of wisdom, this social prophet, the movement founder, all of these things. And I think each of us, some people are going to be more along the lines of what Mike just mentioned about getting on the Jesus train. That's the movement founder. I'm getting on this train. I'm going. And then there are others who are going to say this wisdom, this contrary wisdom thing, is really engaging, and I can take that and do something with that. And others really are going to explore that deeper nature of who and what God is in their life. I think, we see this sort of borne out in all of the various religious orders that have grown up over time in Catholicism and Anglicanism. Some are contemplative, and they see their role as being borne out in praying or in spiritual direction. Others are very active, and to say that we can only follow Jesus in one way, I think is very limiting of Jesus' ability to inspire us. And that we can go in a lot of different directions. But his overall point is that to put Jesus in a box is not a good idea, because Jesus will break that box, and then where are you left?
Toward the end of his section on macro stories, Borg says that all of the stories are stories of a journey. And later in that same paragraph, he said, God accepts us just as we are, wherever we are on our journey. And I've often thought that he should have ended the book right there. Because I think that's a key message for us, that God accepts us no matter which journey we want to take, no matter where we are on that journey.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he relates that in some respects to that priestly story too, which of course says you're a sinner. There's got to be something, but God accepts you in that place on that journey. And I think to go back to this whole culture of purity thing, I think God accepts us anywhere we are. We like to say that, well, if you're not on our part of the journey, you're still impure. Or there's something wrong about what's going on in your step of the journey. And I think, you know, that's not where Borg would go, or where Borg would say that Jesus was going with this. So yeah, thank you, Dan. I was also going to say, in response to what you were talking about, Mike, is that of course Bishop Curry, the you know, our presiding bishop, he has come out with while the sort of 7 things that we did, I think last Lent, on the way of love. You know, sort of emphasizing this journey aspect to it, that it's not the destination of love, it's the way of love. This thing keeps going. So any other thoughts?
I think the book really causes us to reflect on our own lives and where we've been, and those times when we felt like we were in exile, or we felt like we were in freedom, or we were wandering, or we were journeying. And I know in my particular case, I did that with the last chapter because it caused me to do that. And it was a real interesting exercise. But I always kept God and Jesus at arm's length. And then when that period of time when I did a lot of alphas and when I did a lot of faithful lives, suddenly Jesus and relationship with me really changed. And that really, it meant a lot to me, because I was much closer to Jesus, as I think we talked about. I felt like a good part of my life was involved with the conventional wisdom, and during that period of time, I think I got involved in a lot of alternative wisdom, which really brought me much closer to Jesus.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you all for a lively discussion.